John is the historian of the FBI, a true expert on this topic he is about to discuss. He's been the FBI historian since 2003. He was awarded a PhD in modern American history from the University of New Hampshire in 2001 and a master's in political science from Boston College in 1993. His articles have appeared in a number of journals, the FBI's website, and other venues. He has contributed chapters in several books and co-written The FBI, A Centennial History. Fox has been involved in several cooperative museum projects, including a temporary exhibit on the FBI and the media that was on display at the museum from June 2008 until June 2016. He has appeared in many documentaries in the US and Europe, on C-SPAN, CBS Sunday News, CNN, and Turner Classic Movies. John.
Thank you, Jason. I come to you having done FBI history and largely intelligence history for a long time. I got involved in it because I had nothing better to do at the time. In fact, I wasn't really interested in the idea that I was pitching, and I was only doing it because we had a lot of the manuscripts I needed for sources at the university. And one of my professors took pity on me and had some old FBI files on a spy case. And the intelligence bug hit me. And I had been interested in espionage, counterintelligence especially, since the mid-90s. What I'd like to talk to you today about is how the US really started to learn to do counterintelligence, and what counterintelligence actually is, and what we should expect from it. I tell people I'm a 20th century historian. I don't have to deal with current issues, which is kind of fun, but obviously all this has bearing because it shows how we were moving in the direction where we are today, where intelligence itself is a tabletop discussion every day, because it is so important to what our government does, in part to protect us. So, with that, let's go back. 20th century is when intelligence really becomes a key feature in nation states. We've had spies since the time of the Bible. And we can go back to the early days of Greece or Rome and talk about intelligence in those nations. We can talk about how through the Middle Ages it rises. But as an actual functioning part of a modern nation state, World War I is a real turning point. And yet the US was really just coming to it in many ways. You know, we can go back and we can trace George Washington as a spy master and talk about how he used spies. In many ways, it's using military scouts. What we think of as intelligence today is a 20th century invention. And as I said, in World War I, the US was caught flat-footed. We really didn't know what we were doing. And the British and the Germans were both engaged in intensive intelligence operations here in the United States, of which we didn't have a lot of knowledge for a while. It took us a while to learn about it. It took the British handing us a coded message from the Germans to the Mexicans saying, hey, if you guys enter the war and the US gets involved and they lose, maybe you can get some of that part of Texas back that you lost a while ago. Those sorts of things really told American leaders that they needed to get on the ball. Even so, in the 20s and 30s, we weren't doing that much comparatively. Our intelligence services in the Army and the Navy kind of went back to pre-war numbers. State Department got out of intelligence communications, spying in the late 1920s, you know, the whole gentlemen don't spy on or read other gentlemen's mail sort of thing. In many ways, it was law enforcement that was keeping up even some of our code breaking, the Coast Guard, because of the bootleg problem, and trying to intercept ships as they were going. But in the 1930s, things started to change. A couple things were going on. First of all, you have the FBI emerging as really, in many ways, the premier law enforcement organization in the US. 1934, 1935, right at the height of the gangster era, it explodes into the nation's consciousness. You know, that whole G-Man iconography comes to mind. Hollywood's making movies, the newspapers are writing stories about the Bureau every day. You've got radio shows, you've got comic books, you've got kids' toys, you've got, you know, stuff in the cereal boxes, themed to the FBI, all over the place. But that was criminal. And since its beginning, the FBI had also had national security functions. And so as national security matters became more of an issue in the 30s, the FBI started to get more involved. Now, who else was involved? Well, first of all, the Army and the Navy. Right? We've had military attaches since really the 1800s. You know, basically going to other countries to learn what military innovations are going on there. You've got the General Intelligence Division, the Army, stood up. The Office of Naval Intelligence have been stood up, and they've been perking along for ages. You know, sometimes changing in function or organizational structure, that sort of thing. In the 1930s, both those groups start to notice an uptick in espionage against the United States. The Germans especially were starting to get active in the New York area, and the Japanese on the West Coast. And the Navy comes to the Attorney General and says, you know, we're noticing a lot more problems with Japanese students asking questions that they really shouldn't be asking about naval forces and naval bases and things like that. Can you do something about it? Well, the Attorney General says, sure, our investigative arm is the FBI. And the FBI starts working with the Navy on some of these matters. The Germans were also, though, starting to collect intelligence about the United States, especially on the East Coast. And one of their spy rings was discovered in New York in the late 1930s. Gunther Rumrich, born American, lived in Germany for some time, came back here, kind of been in and out of the Army, eventually dismissed on dishonorable discharge, had agreed to spy for the Germans. And he had first tried to get blank passport applications. Anybody know why you'd want blank passport applications? Let me go back. Blank passports. He wanted blank passports. Why? Anybody know?
So you can't trace the person?
Okay. So you can't trace it. It provides an identity, right? You can fake then a U.S. official document. The reason why I flubbed with passport applications because that's what he ended up asking for. And so he pretended to be a State Department rep, said, I've got a meeting, I need a bunch of blank passports. The guy heard blank passport application, sent him a package of those to the hotel where he was. Wasn't what he was looking for. Because the Germans weren't applying for U.S. passports, they wanted to fake it. Well, he decided to try again. And what happened was he sent his case officer back in Berlin a note saying, look, I'm going to pretend to be an Army officer. I'm going to call up and say I've got to give a briefing here in New York. I need to see the East Coast defense plans. Bring them to my hotel immediately. And then he was going to knock the carrier out and take the plans and send them back to Germany. Wasn't the brightest bulb in Well, what happened is this. To send the letter to Germany, he didn't send it directly to Germany because he knew the Brits would intercept it. Sent it to Scotland to a dead letter drop. There's a middle-aged woman, she a widower, who lived there. She was a hairdresser. Was taking letters for British intelligence or for German intelligence, packaging them all together and then sending them to Germany through different channels. The Brits had learned of it. They intercepted the letter. They said, this doesn't sound really plausible, but we better warn the Americans just in case. We don't want one of their people getting hurt. So they send the information through State Department. State Department talks to Army. Army talks to the New York Police Department, says, hey, can you see what this guy's up to? New York Police Department arrests the guy. What charge? Well, now they've got this guy in custody. They know something's going on, and that he has ties to British or to German intelligence. And it's a mess. So they hand him over to the FBI and say, investigate. FBI puts a guy named Leon Theroux on to it. Theroux interviews Rumrick, he interviews a bunch of other people Rumrick is connected with, identifies 16 people associated with German intelligence in New York. Tells them we're going to have grand jury hearings on this matter, be around in the next 2 weeks. Well, most of them disappeared. In the meantime, Rumrick's still under detention. They caught a couple of other people who didn't get the message about the grand jury. Either they came in a bit later and so were able to be arrested and held. But eventually the trial comes about. It comes out just before the trial that Theroux had reached an agreement with the newspapers that he'd do a whole story about the big spy case that was being broken during the trial. That's not good either. Not least of which he wasn't authorized to do so by the Bureau, so Hoover fires him. Theroux eventually winds up in military intelligence, actually works counterintelligence in Europe. He wasn't an awful investigator, and as long as he wasn't working with the press, he was not bad either as an agent. Regardless, it's an embarrassment. And Hoover realizes that the Bureau has to start doing things differently with regards to counterintelligence. Now, think of it at this point. All counterintelligence is for the United States is identifying spies. In other words, people who have already damaged your security. And we weren't very good at it at that point. But war is heating up. The whole Rumrick trial is happening in 1938. What happens in summer of 38? World War II starts. Breaks out. 39, sorry. I'm getting my dates mixed up now. Breaks out in 39. So right after the Rumrick stuff. By then, the United States executive branch realizes it's got to do something. And the people who had been lower-level officials in World War I knew what was going on because they'd seen it happen before and they didn't want that to happen again. So what they did was the Army and the Navy and the FBI started to talk about how are we going to protect America from intelligence threats while this war is going on in Europe. Remember, war breaks out in 1939. The United States doesn't enter until December 1941. So the Army and the Navy and the FBI start dividing up responsibility for protecting America from intelligence threats. State Department's still kind of in the mix. But they're not worried about enforcement issues. They just care about intelligence flow. And that becomes a problem because the Brits are trying to get information to us about threats. They want, one, to develop deeper contacts with us so that maybe we'll come in the war on their side. And two, they know that Germany is going to look to the United States for allies. Not necessarily the US government, we're not going to support the Nazis, but allies within the United States. There are a lot of people of German descent. There are a lot of people who think, hey, that Hitler guy's got the right idea. A lot of other people thought that Stalin guy had the right idea. So you got two groups in America supporting Russia or the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And they are willing to provide aid. And of course other things. The US is a major manufacturer, so it's got a lot of stuff it can give, or sell more likely, to the European powers. And then the last war, all that commerce went to Great Britain because the Navy controlled the Atlantic and the Germans couldn't get things across the Atlantic. That's why they went to submarine warfare to try and blow up ships as they were going across. And that, of course, created problems in itself in World War I. So, things are inching forward. The United States is starting to pay more attention to what a hostile intelligence service might be doing. One thing that they find out is that they don't have a lot of information about what's going on south of the border, South and Central America. And so in 1940, the FBI starts sending undercover agents to our southern neighbors as spies. In other words, they go abroad, using non-official covers, representing stock brokerage firms selling investment products, insurance agents. One guy went as a tennis pro. Another guy went as a golf pro, kind of traveling golf pro. One guy ended up being so influential down there that he became the national security advisor to the president of the country. They were going abroad to collect intelligence, and they had no idea what they were doing. They received some quick language training, although they tried to get people who could speak Spanish or Portuguese right off the bat, and there were some of those in the Bureau, and they were among the first bunch to go. They gave them some rudimentary intelligence training, and by then we'd been starting to learn a little bit about what the intelligence game was about. Because the British, as I said, were trying to provide us information that could help us out. So what do? Well, they invite the people involved in US security to come over and see what they're doing. William Stevenson becomes a key part of this. He was a Canadian, but he ended up working with British intelligence to try and be a liaison between the two countries. He introduces himself to the FBI in early 1940, also starts working with a guy named William Donovan, who many of you have probably heard about. Donovan eventually becomes the coordinator of information, and then creates what's known as the OSS, or Office of Strategic Services, many of the parts of the OSS end up being the nucleus for the creation of the CIA a couple of years later. Remember, we don't have a CIA at this point. US intelligence consists of the Army, the Navy, State Department, FBI, a few other smaller components here and there. That's it. Army and the Navy are mostly concentrating, Navy, of course, in the Pacific, working to break Japanese codes. Army's starting to concentrate on the German codes. Eventually, that will all come together in the Ultra program. We're starting to ramp up a bit. And the Brits are taking an interest in what the FBI is doing and invites a couple of FBI people over. Hugh Clegg, Assistant Director of the FBI, he's in charge of basically counter-espionage at the time, national security investigations. Lawrence Hintz is a special agent. They're invited to go over to England. This is a cartoon from our employee magazine. And you'll notice that it says that, where is it? The British gentleman is saying that now to return to the problem of law enforcement. Notice, even within the FBI, they're not saying why these guys are going over to England, but what they end up doing is meeting with representatives of both MI5 and MI6 and starting to see how the Brits are working to protect their homeland. Now, they don't get an intro to signals intelligence operations yet. They don't get an intro immediately to the double cross program, which was the double agents program. Both of those are still developing. But within a couple of years, the FBI actually is brought into both of those secrets and getting information from it in order to do its job. William Donovan does much the same thing and, of course, gets a lot of his ideas from the British and works those into the OSS. The Canadians are doing the same. In fact, the Canadians are offering basically covert operations training up in Canada to US intelligence offices. And both the OSS and the FBI are taking some advantage of that. Pearl Harbor attacks occur. What's the state of German espionage in the US? Well, it's basically been broken. During the summer, just before the Pearl Harbor attacks, the FBI had broken up a German spy ring in New York, led by a man named Fritz Duquesne, who had been active in German intelligence since really World War I. And Duquesne was arrested along with about 33 other spies. And the FBI had wrapped up the operation. They were using a double agent in it. They were engaged in basically sending intelligence back to Germany by radio, but controlling the content so that secrets weren't going. They weren't using it for disinformation yet. That would come later. But they were really starting to ramp up their operations. They had to do it in conjunction with the Army and the Navy because the intelligence that they did send over had to be approved so that they weren't compromising secrets. They only ran that double agent operation for a couple of months. So it was a very short-term thing, but it really provided them the germ of what to do next. And so through the war, building on what we'd learned from the English, U.S. intelligence began to improve rapidly. And in fact, because of our earlier code-breaking work, especially in the Army and the Navy, and because of the amount of resources that we could put into it, we were able to really move quickly, comparatively, in breaking Japanese codes, making headway in the Germans, and when we started, of course, working with the English, we were able to leverage technology so that we could actually break German codes almost as quickly, if not as quickly, as the Germans themselves. And that, of course, provided us a real advantage in dealing with German attacks and preventing them. But it also gave us significant counterintelligence information because it was that signals intelligence that the British were using to make sure that their double agent program was working properly. And the FBI started to get involved in that as well, running double agents of their own. In fact, one of the ones that we ran was known as a notional agent. In other words, we made him up because we had another German agent that we had intercepted. We pretended to be him and send intelligence back. He said, I've hired this other guy, and this is the intelligence I'm getting from him. But he was make-believe. Mark Felt was actually running one of those double agents. You may remember him from Watergate. So it's kind of where he started to get some of his skills, I guess you could say. By the end of World War II, what was the state of U.S. intelligence? Well, if you just look at numbers, it had grown phenomenally. The FBI grew from a couple of hundred people in the late 30s to 14,000. Of those, a good 2/3 were probably working national security matters. Tens of thousands of sabotage allegations investigated. Our operations in South and Central America led to the creation of official liaison offices. At the height of it, we had about 360 undercover agents in the Western Hemisphere. We had official liaison with the Canadians and with the British. We were following the Army as it was moving from Italy up towards Germany to the close of the war to gather intelligence that would help us with the work that we were doing. The Army and the Navy both had extensive intelligence operations going. The OSS had several thousand people working for it itself. And so U.S. intelligence seemed to be on the top of its game. It had done very well against the Germans. It had done well against the Japanese. We were too ignorant, though, of the Soviet Union and the threat that it posed. Soviets were our allies. And Soviet intelligence had been actively recruiting Americans, largely for technical espionage in the 1930s, but also looking for political intelligence and so forth. They'd been building up their resources, and if it wasn't for their own internal turmoil, things like Stalin's purge of his foreign officers and the intelligence and military communities in the 30s, they probably would have had even more success. But at the end of World War II, the Soviets had dozens of agents in and around the U.S. government, dozens more in and around sensitive U.S. technology operations. They had infiltrated the Manhattan Project and been stealing atomic secrets. infiltrated other technological operations that gave them significant military secrets about airplane engines, about bomb making, radar, and other operations like that. And although the US government was aware of some of this, they'd largely been turning a blind eye. You know, if you look at, say, FBI resources involved here, the Bureau had probably 18 to 20 squads in New York devoted to Nazi primarily, but also Japanese and Italian espionage. They had 2 or 3 devoted to Soviet operations. Although they knew that the Soviets were trying to infiltrate the Manhattan Project, they knew that AMTOR, the American Trading Organization, which had been in New York since the 1920s, was acting as a front for Soviet espionage. And they knew that the Soviet diplomatic officials were engaged in contacting members of the US Communist Party and other groups to try and get recruits. But we were at war with Germany. Soviets were our allies. When the war ends in Japan, in the East, in the late summer of 1945, that shift changes. A code clerk up in Canada named Igor Guzenko, actually here, I've got 2 slides, you can just, you can't read it, you weren't meant to, but this is a list of active Soviet spies in America in early 1940s. Came from some notes taken on KGB documents by a former KGB officer listing the known failures by 1947, 48. We'll get to why those are known failures. But these were known spies. There were a lot. In 1945, a code clerk up in Canada worked for the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence, defects to the RCMP. Canadians almost hand them back to the Russians, but the Brits talk him out of it. He brings with him information about Canadian espionage, but also American espionage because of the ties between the 2 countries. And it starts to open up eyes. A couple of weeks later, a woman named Elizabeth Bentley walks into the FBI in New York and starts telling her story of having been a courier for 2 spy rings in Washington, D.C. Every couple of weeks, she'd come down to D.C. from New York, meet with a bunch of people, take home a knitting bag full of secrets, she would say. You got a knitting bag full of secrets? Perfect. Maybe you could get Jason, he'll put it on display.
I'll never trust a knitter again.
This is, the bottom circles are a list of US government employees that Bentley mentions getting information from. And the boxes are what offices in the US government the FBI had to inform about that because they worked for that office and had access to their information. That's just a picture, in one way, of some of this penetration that was going on. Mentioned Guzenko. He was rather dramatic. He would appear with a disguise anytime he was actually on the news. The case itself was called Corby by the Canadians in the Bureau. It was named after a whiskey brand that was common between the 2. The Bentley case was called Gregory, and it was, I'm not sure why we call it Gregory, actually. I don't think it was because of the principal spy was a guy named Nathan Gregory Silvermaster. I don't think it was based on him. It'd be pretty stupid to name the case after him that directly, because usually you try to use the name to disguise who you're talking about. That'd be pretty straightforward, but you never knew. In those days, we were a little looser on some of those things. But with those 2 coming in and the information they gave, the US government realized the extent of the problem that it was facing. This is how the Cold War starts for us in so many ways. in a sense, the realization that the Soviet Union had been spending so much time penetrating us, even while they were our allies and we were providing with millions of dollars in goods and services, technology, and other aid, so that they could stand up to Hitler's forces. A couple of things were happening now. 1945 is when these revelations are coming out. What happened? The FBI initiates extensive investigations of all the people who are named by both defectors, Bentley and Guzenko. And what did they find? Well, nothing direct. See, as soon as Guzenko defected, the Soviets had put their spies on hold. They said, stop. We don't know what the damage is yet. We'll find out. And they had penetrations in British intelligence and American intelligence who could tell them exactly what was happening, really almost as soon as the Brits or the Americans found out. They were that hot. And so the Soviets knew what the damage was going to be pretty quickly. And if they're not spying, you can't catch them spying. So we have Bentley's word. She doesn't have any of those living bags full of secrets anymore yet. She passed them on and they went off to Russia. Guzenko had stuffed his shirt full of documents, so at least there were those. But it was mostly about Canadian stuff. The FBI can look at it and say, well, Bentley says this about this person, and Bentley said that about that person, and it's true. And the more they looked at what she said, the more they saw was true. But they couldn't say that this person spied. You got to catch them red-handed all. It's tough catching a spy. So for 2 years, these investigations are going on. What happens is this. The Army has a crucial signals intelligence, or code-breaking breakthrough. They start to realize that they can decrypt telegrams that the Soviet diplomatic establishments in the U.S. have been sending back to Moscow during the war. And during the war, the U.S. collected all traffic, cables, telegrams, going over to Europe from these types of places. And they were able to start to break the decryption or the encryption and break the codes on some of those telegrams. It was the Army Signal Service, eventually becomes NSA largely. A guy named Meredith Gardner was crucial to the breakthrough. We end up calling this whole thing Venona today, if you want to look it up. Incredibly important for Cold War counterintelligence. Because what Venona does, and this is a message from Venona, it's a decrypted, decoded telegram talking about Soviet espionage. What Venona allows us to do is start to see what the KGB especially was doing during World War II. And so one message that it gets, and by this point, the Army is working with the FBI. An FBI agent had learned about these, his name was Bob Lamphere, and said, look, I think we can do something with this. And he talked to Frank Rowlett over at the Army, he talked to Meredith Gardner and said, look, the FBI has all sorts of information about Soviets and who they contacted and things like that. If I take that information with what you are finding in these telegrams, I bet I can make more sense of it and help you out. And this cooperation becomes incredibly important. So when the Army finds this message that says, on this date, in 1944, a young woman who was a communist is transferring from this part of the Department of Justice to this part of the Department of Justice, doesn't name the woman, just that she was a fellow communist and that she was transferring. Lamphere takes that message, goes to the Department of Justice, and finds out immediately who she is. Not only that, but she's still working there, and she has access to classified material, largely from the FBI. Her name was Judith Copeland. FBI immediately starts surveilling her, starts to try and build a case that she is still an active spy. And they find out that she goes up to New York regularly meets with a Soviet official. That's a little suspicious. Well, eventually they set up a trap. We're going to wave basically a document of classified material that she can't resist. And when she takes that material and heads to New York, we will follow her and catch her in the act of actually passing it off. It goes really well. The map here is actually, it's hard to see, but it is the FBI's courtroom diagram of the route that Judith Copland and her case officer took in New York, where they wandered around Manhattan for 2.5 hours each to try and shape any surveillance that was following. It was called a dry cleaning route in kind of tradecraft parlance. She had a pocketbook full of secrets. She was caught with a Soviet official. They tried to play it off as, well, basically they're lovers and that she was going to write a book or something. Didn't fly. She's convicted in Washington. She's convicted in New York. Both verdicts are overturned on technicalities. Her lawyer was able to get the court to think that the FBI had used wiretaps to get knowledge about Copland to go after her. Now, they had used wiretaps. And in those days, you could not get a court warrant to use electronic surveillance. And so it was inadmissible as evidence. And so the idea was that the FBI's case, the Department of Justice's case, was prejudiced because it relied on poisoned fruit. In other words, stuff that was inadmissible. Now, the problem was it was based on a signals intelligence breakthrough, a cryptographic success. But how do you show that in court? One, top secret. Venona was top secret until 1995. There were leaks coming out before then, but overall, it was considered classified. And the Army was not going to compromise it in court. Because to bring it into court and show that it was good evidence, they had to show how they broke the code. They had to show the steps that they took, the people that did it. They had to put everything out there. And they weren't going to do that. And furthermore, how do you convince a juror audience that this sheet of random-looking numbers equals this kind of information here? It could be really hard. And a jury might not accept it if it's not presented right. So this was not verboten. It wasn't going to be used. Well, as I said, Copland got off. Ended up marrying one of her attorneys, opened up a restaurant in New York. She died about 10 years ago at this point. Never facing the consequences for her espionage. And she had spied for a couple of years. Regardless, Venona allowed us to really get into what Soviet intelligence was doing. And it provided really good corroboration of what Bentley and a couple of other people were telling the FBI. Now, there was another problem in the day: politics. What did the public know about all this? Nothing. They knew that the FBI had captured spies in World War II. They knew that eventually leaks about Bentley and some of these other things came out, so there were political ramifications. And the ramifications were this. All the spies were considered to be left of the political center. They were connected to the New Deal. Many of them had come in to work in the government of Franklin Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt had died just before the end of World War II. Truman had taken over. Truman's up for re-election. And it's become a political issue because a former State Department official named Alger Hiss has been accused of spying by a former reporter, an editor known as Whittaker Chambers, and it has become national news. So on August 3rd, this is all breaking out in front of Congress. On August 5th, 1948, President Truman says, no, it's just a red herring. You know, people are trying to get you off the election and convince you that there's spies all over the place. You can ignore it. It's just a political issue. The problem was it wasn't just a political issue. There really were lots of spies, and they had done tremendous damage. Pretty soon after this, of course, the Soviets detonate the first atomic bomb. People realized that the Soviets had stolen the secret of the atomic bomb. And it was a deep concern. Soviets would have found one, you know, eventually developed their own bomb, and that's pretty clear. They had good scientists, they had good mathematicians. But what they got from us were details that helped them to do it that much more quickly. Not long after that, of course, we were involved in the Korean conflict, the war that was happening over in Asia, kind of that first hot war of the Cold War. It's all coming to a head. But Venona had allowed us to basically deal with the threat that was behind us. We were able to get a lot of people out of positions of sensitive information. We were able to get a lot of people out of government. We were eventually able to start identifying some of the moles that were in Great Britain, although that would take longer, especially Kim Philby, who was one of the most damaging of all. But as this older problem of penetrations were being wrapped up, the US government could go more offensive on its counterintelligence. In other words, take the game not just to identifying a spy, because if you found a spy in your works, it means you failed. The spy got in and was successful. What you want to do is to catch that person before they start spying. Either identify someone who might be a spy and keep them out, or if someone is just starting to be a spy, watch what they're doing, control what they're doing. Use that to get into the other organization, get into the hostile service, penetrate the other side. If you want success in counterintelligence, the best thing to do is to have an official in the other agency. Soviets have done it a couple times. U.S. has done it. If you think of the Soviets, Kim Philby, of course, was British intelligence official in counterintelligence. He was about as damaging as you could get. Bob Hansen on our side, you know, from the FBI later, in the 1980s, 1990s, arrested in 2001, would be another example. For us, we started to try and recruit people who could do that for us, and started to have some success. Double agents. Gentleman here speaking to the microphone is named Morris Childs. He was a communist official from his late teens. He was heavily involved in the creation and rise of the Communist Party. Eventually had a falling out with them in the 1940s and had some health problems and kind of faded out, kind of a mix of political rivalries and ill health, leading to him being not really shunned by the party, but certainly ostracized to some extent. He became disillusioned with them, and the FBI started to talk to him. And he was willing to work with the Bureau as long as he could get his health back. So the FBI arranges for him to go to the Mayo Clinic. Now, that's expensive. How do you pay for it? He can't just appear out of nowhere and have the money to do it. So his brother, who was the one who kind of got him in touch with the FBI in the first place, goes around to all the communist friends and says, hey, we're having a fund to get money together to send Morris to the Mayo Clinic to help him get better. And Jack Child's idea was this: none of them are going to give. They're all cheap jerks. But none of them are going to say, hey, I didn't give. Where did you get the money from? They're all going to say, oh, of course I gave. Morris got the money. His health improved enough. He started to go abroad representing the Communist Party, got back in good graces with them, and basically became their Secretary of State. Between 1958 and 1978, he went abroad. We'll see in a minute how many times. Signals intelligence cooperation. The FBI and the Army and eventually National Security Agency worked well together, taking that SIGINT product and using it for counterintelligence purposes. In turn, the FBI started to provide help getting materials about diplomatic codes and ciphers for the NSA so that they could do a better job of breaking codes. Intensification program was something that the US government was doing to basically put more pressure on Soviet diplomatic establishments. More surveillance, more coverage, paying attention to who was coming in and what they were doing, and limiting where they could go. Border coverage, or Bokov program, was to keep an eye on who was coming into the country from places that were known to be spying, to look for anomalies and to look for problems. Technological innovation, of course, trying to apply the latest communications, photographic, etc. technology. And Jason was talking about some of that earlier, with the U2 surveillances and some of those developments. But more simply, as tubes gave way to transistors and electronics technology changed, applying that to the work that the Bureau and other agencies did. And COINTELPRO. It's in ill repute today, and for good reason. But the original idea of COINTELPRO, or counterintelligence programs, was looking at the Communist Party. It had been a tool of Soviet intelligence for decades. How do we prevent them from doing that in the future? And the idea was we should disrupt them. Now, problematically, it takes the FBI out of that law enforcement function that it's supposed to be involved in, and puts them into a situation where they're involved in compromising First Amendment rights, especially. Can't do that. But the idea was to go after the Communist Party using all the tools that it could. And so that's where that came from. Of course, politics is still involved. What's happening in 1950? As the US government is intensifying its efforts to go proactive against the Soviet Union, it's becoming a political issue. I talked about Truman kind of trying to dismiss the idea of Soviet espionage being a threat at the time, or at least being connected to the New Deal in any real way. Obviously, Joe McCarthy comes out. And in February of 1950, he gives a speech in West Virginia saying that, hey, I've got a list of the names of 100 some odd State Department officials engaged in intelligence work for the Soviets. Now, the problem is McCarthy didn't really know what he was talking about. He had the outlines, he had some of the flavor, but he really didn't know the actual secrets. He didn't know about Venona. He didn't know about what was really happening in the government in that sense. He knew enough that he knew that it was a problem, but it became a political issue and ended up creating all sorts of conflict politically that didn't help expand our security. Now, part of the problem was, in those days, everything was kept secret. You didn't discuss these issues like we would today. The NSA was created in 1950. Inside the government, those who knew about it called it no such agency. When the Washington Post actually did a story of it in the, I think it was about 1956, NSA employees took it home and said, I can't talk about what I do, but read this. The understanding of intelligence was not what it is today. Doesn't mean there isn't a lot of myth and ignorance in there. Hollywood obviously has its representations which vaguely resemble the truth. It's kind of like when you have a movie about a historical subject. Hollywood likes to flavor things with history, but it is not history. But regardless, so the politics are becoming an issue, but U.S. was really successful in dealing with the Soviet problem for a time. This is a list of the missions that Morris Childs would go on for the FBI. 55 times between 58 and 78, going abroad, representing the Communist Party, meeting with all the major officials of the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, bringing back reams of intelligence. Now, because the FBI was never that great at analysis, and because of the compartmentalization of it, Morris's revelations really kind of just went to key figures. CIA wanted in, and the FBI kind of kept it shut out. They worked together on a lot of other things very well. But the Operation Solo, as it was called, probably did not yield as many fruits as it could have. Even so, it did have an impact, not least of which it gave the US an idea of what the Soviets were thinking directly. Morris was over there when JFK was killed. And so information about what Soviet leaders' reactions were came directly from someone who saw it. Obviously, the FBI became the center of this focus. The emphasis on counter-espionage rather than counterintelligence more broadly kind of remains. You know, people usually think that if you're catching spies, you're doing a good job. For counterintelligence, though, it's actually deeper than that. See, it's really hard to learn. It can take a while, and it's not something you pick up overnight. In fact, learning the idea of going from we have to identify the spies and get rid of them to we have to penetrate the other side takes some time. But with the help of some of our allies, with a lot of on-the-job training in the face of war, the U.S. improved significantly. And it set up, of course, the creation of the CIA, the creation of a national intelligence community, and, of course, the whole Five Eyes, or the cooperation agreements between the U.S., Great Britain, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, which really revolutionized intelligence cooperation. Signals intelligence, of course, is central to that, but also a strong commitment, especially in the FBI, to its personnel. There's a reason why the FBI really does not have a significant penetration issue until the late 60s. This would be the first one, and that's not confirmed, just largely suspected. The first FBI agent arrested for spying, 1984. So the FBI had been going for a very long time without a penetration. Whereas in World War II, what did the OSS have? About 15 Soviet spies working for them? Secrecy is an issue. It can compromise court cases. It can compromise the public's ability to understand what's going on and to act in a reasonable manner. It can lead to political demagoguery. All too often, that's where ignorance, of course, leads to. And ultimately, the U.S. was able to force the Soviets to change the way they did things. The model for Soviet intelligence from its creation in 1919 through the early Cold War was to use ideological agents. In other words, people who believed that the Soviet Union was the way of the future, and they wanted in on that, and they wanted to support it. The success in dealing with those ideological agents led the Soviets to have to shift to a largely illegal-driven model. In other words, agents who are sent over to infiltrate slowly and quietly and pretend to be citizens, to, by the 1960s, starting to rely on those people who are basically willing to sell secrets for money. And of course, money has become the principal reason why people spy today. So, on the one hand, success leads to forcing the other guy to change the way they do things. On the other hand, the other guy still keeps at it and sometimes does it very well. And problematically, when you fail, sometimes you innovate, and that makes it harder to keep up with them. But regardless, the lessons that kind of went forth in the early Cold War really stay with us today. So, open it up to questions. Happy to consider just about anything. I have answered questions from UFOs to various conspiracies to Hoover in the dress, which is a myth, in case you're wondering. Yes.
So hang on a second because we are filming this. Let me wait and get the microphone to you, and we'll move around that way. So we got a question over here. Yes,
By the
sir.
way, I usually recommend history and caffeine going together, especially for FBI audiences. I think history and beer is better.
In the case of the woman with the knitting bag in New York, what happened to the Russian diplomat or whoever she was working with? Were they able to expel him to keep any further secrets from passing?
Well, the one that she was working with was eventually identified. He'd already left the country. So in that sense, no. Problem was the Soviets were trying to get her out of the position at that point. She'd kind of fallen into it because she was working with a guy named Jacob Gallos who ran a travel agency, basically. And Gallos was the actual intelligence agent. He died of a heart attack, and so she kind of took over. And the Soviets were starting to realize, you know, this really is a pretty amateurish operation. We should make it more professional. They thought, well, maybe we can find somebody to marry her and get her out of the picture. Or we can just get her out of it. But we want to keep her happy because otherwise she's going to go blabbing about it. You know, she's in this in part for pride. And what happens is they kind of do it so ham-handedly that she does become disillusioned and decides, no, I'm going to go to the U.S. government instead. So the problem is, by then they were working her out of it anyway. They identified, you know, at least one or two people who would meet with her. You know, the best you can do is PNG them or persona non grata them. You know, kick them out of the country because they're on diplomatic credentials. The biggest problem was who the penetrations had been and whether or not, you know, they were still compromising U.S. secrets.
Well, here's a historical perspective with the FBI, OSS development, and the CIA. Can you talk a little bit about territorial jurisdiction aspects for that? What the FBI might have been doing before, the CIA might be doing later on. How were the lines kind of said, well, that's our area, your area, or both of our areas within a cloud or a gray area?
Well, there were certainly gray areas. You know, FBI, of course, starts getting into foreign intelligence collection 2 years before the OSS is created. So by the time Donovan's group basically is operational, the FBI is in charge of collecting in the Western Hemisphere, and Donovan's kind of frozen out of that. Most of OSS's operations are in Europe and the India-Burma theater. You know, so that kind of Southeast Asia there. MacArthur didn't like them, so he kind of kept them out of certain things, especially in the Pacific. So the OSS is largely on the Eurasian continent. There were constant headbuttings because the OSS was trying to do as much as it could. You know, Donovan had a very expansive view. And so they're butting heads in the U.S. You know, there are lots of stories about that. Some of them are even true. Hoover's opinion could kind of be summed up like this. When they were discussing, you know, Truman shut down the OSS right after the war, closed them out, cut the organization apart, shipped out the components to the largest state army. But they knew that they needed some central intelligence organization. We wanted the FBI out of foreign intelligence. And so he was going to cut off the FBI service at the same time as the OSS. But states said, no, we really need this, and there's nothing else to replace it at the moment. So they kept that going for another year and a half or so. And in the interim, they created the Central Intelligence Group, and then under the National Security Act of 47, they created the CIA. And what the National Security Act says is that the CIA's activities will be to collect intelligence outside of U.S. borders. In other words, they create, you know, a line that the CIA will not act within U.S. sovereign territory, but it will collect intelligence against everything else. The FBI's undercover operations in South and Central America go over to CIA. In fact, you know, there are at least, we know anecdotally that at least a few of the FBI guys end up going over to CIA and they're early station chiefs. And so there's this division between domestic and foreign. But the problem is this: intelligence crosses borders, right? Agents move back and forth. Diplomats who are acting, you know, who act as intelligence officers, moving back and forth. Other countries, third parties are involved. So FBI and CIA have to work together. And in many ways, they work together pretty well. Where there are clear boundaries, where they're working, you know, personalities get in the way sometimes. You know, Hoover's especially could be problematic. But overall, they kind of work those things out pretty well. Such that when an FBI recruited agent goes back overseas, CIA takes over, vice versa. Solo being maybe the big exception. The FBI kind of kept him, you know, because he was a direct representative of the U.S. Communist Party, and kind of seen as, you know, a feather in the cap sort of thing. Okay, one there and then up here.
Near the end, you mentioned a suspected penetration of the FBI in the 1960s. Could
Yes.
you elaborate on that?
The case is known as Unsub Dick. Unsub means unknown subject. Dick being, what happened is this. Soviet walks into the New York office in, I forget exactly when, but walks into the New York office and basically says, I want to start cooperating with you. This is happening around 69. And they say, well, okay, but how do you know that, you know, you're not compromised already? He said, oh, I'm not worried about that. All of our guys are out, you know, covering the meeting with your guy, Dick. And so that's how the case name came about. David Wise has written an article on it. It was pretty good. I think it appeared in Smithsonian. He's mentioned it in one of his books. So there are a lot of outside reports. As far as FBI records go, there's no confirmation that has gone out to the public, but I mean, at this point, largely it's because no one's asked yet. And tragically, David Wise died, you know, fairly recently, and isn't going to be able to write on it anymore. But that's the first kind of, you know, there was an incident in World War II where we were looking for a relative of a Communist Party member who was supposed to have gotten a job at the FBI, but that's about as close as it came. You know, whereas, of course, Britain had the Cambridge Five, you know, and the other agencies have all had their penetration. So the FBI's focus on character and ideology in its background checks paid dividends as long as we were dealing with ideological agents. When it came down to money, people can become compromised eventually in many ways, and the suspicion on the Dick job is that he was a New York agent who, you know, was in financial straits and started selling secrets for a time. But whether that he was ever found, we don't know.
Other questions?
I think we had one up here. Did you?
Okay.
Hold on one sec, Jason's got one.
A quick comment, and I'd like maybe John to say a few words about this. If you're interested in learning about how we went sort of from 0 to 60 in the intelligence area, it has to do with William Stevenson, and one of the great books on that is a man called Intrepid. You might want to comment on that, or we have other recommendations.
Yeah, I will have other recommendations.
Okay.
Stevenson's book is problematic.
Okay.
You know, if you read, say, Thomas Troy, who's a former CIA historian, who writes some good stuff on it, you can find it online.
Okay.
It's got a lot of problems.
Okay.
Stevenson himself was an interesting character, but he had this very grandiose idea of being, in a sense, kind of the hub for British U.S. intelligence.
Yeah.
And tried to create a very large intelligence service here in the United States, operating out of Rockefeller Center, which is ironic since the Soviets were there, The FBI's SIS program was out of there. Stevenson was out of there, and several others as well. But that's, the center of New York. Hoover really opposed the idea that we should have a foreign intelligence service operating without any necessary knowledge by the U.S. government and with largely impunity to do what they want. He didn't want that to happen. Donovan wanted to kind of expand borders enough that he worked with Stevenson more closely. That's where some of that friction came from. Of course, Hoover and Donovan had history from the DOJ days back in the 1920s. But Stevenson's reputation ends up being overblown a little bit, not least of which is Intrepid wasn't his code name. Kind of the book's title starts with a myth. It was William Stevenson. Was it William Stevenson who wrote it? Stevenson was writing about Stevenson. One had a V in the name, one had a PH. But he was a reporter. He was basing it on kind of stories that had been being told by Stevenson just before he was dying. Stevenson destroyed all the records of British security coordination, or at least a good number of them, right after he had a couple of guys write up the official history. One of them was Roald Dahl, author of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Dahl had worked for Stevenson during World War II. Another guy was Ian Fleming, who worked for Stevenson off and on. So, big impact, absolutely. Problematic, also. And, in some ways, his mythology is a little bit bigger. If you read The Real Intrepid by a Canadian historian, forget his name, it's actually a good book on it. Or Thomas Troy's stuff, he was an official historian for the CIA, is quite balanced. He wrote a book called Hoover and Donovan. Kind of hard to find. I think you can get a digital copy off the CIA website. It's worth reading.
Great, thanks for correcting that.
Would you give us a little more detail on how they set up the Five Eyes and how they started, what services, what information, how they did that?
Oh gosh, that would be at least several more talks, but in short,
just briefly.
Well, it really comes out of that whole cooperation on breaking German and Japanese codes. Especially the relationship of the Army cryptographers and the British cryptographers at Bletchley Park. Of course, the U.S. was working at Arlington Hall. It was that cooperation which became the basis for the agreement, the UK, United States of America agreement, kind of towards the end of the war, right after the war. And pretty quickly, the Canadians were in really from the beginning, although they weren't significant in providing that kind of help. The RCMP wasn't really big into cryptography. Canadian military, of course, was in most cases subsumed under the British. Australia was brought in kind of towards the end of the 40s because Venona was starting to show that some of their politicians were compromised by Soviet intelligence. And it leads to the standing up of the Australian Security Agency and them actually developing a counterintelligence function. New Zealand kind of comes in last of the bunch.
Mostly started with Army secret stuff.
Yeah. So it was the Army and the British cooperation that became the nucleus that kind of grew into this wider.
It's one question I never got. I don't have an answer to. Thank you.
There are a couple of decent books out there. Shoot, can't think of it.
When you do, maybe you could send to me and I could send it out.
Sounds good.
Yeah, you'd mentioned about Truman being dismissive of the Soviet espionage threat, but didn't the FBI warn or go to FDR and tell him that they believed that his administration had been infiltrated, and that was one of the reasons why he dumped Henry Wallace as vice president for Truman?
Well, it wasn't, Henry Wallace wasn't dumped so much for anything related to espionage as much as a combination of he was considered really too amicable towards the Soviet Union, and because of some other kind of loopy things in his background. He had a whole correspondence with a guy named Nicholas Roerich over, it was some weird transcendental sort of thing that, you know, it had kind of been poking around on the public edge but hadn't come out. So it was a bunch of political things, and basically there were enough people in senior administration posts and senior Democratic policy posts that said, you know what, Roosevelt's health isn't that good. We're not sure we want Henry taking over, so they kind of dumped him there. Ironically, Henry, of course, was the neighbor of the spy I did my dissertation on, Martha Stern, up in Connecticut. Had asked her at one point to write speeches for his campaign. And my favorite FBI wiretap must have been of the New York consulate, because she calls up and says, yeah, Henry Wallace just asked me to write speeches for him. Should I do it? And the consulate, kind of figuring they were bugs, said, no, you shouldn't. She did it anyway, but you know, Wallace eventually learns that the Sterns were spying, and that basically, you know, several of his party's officials, you know, he created a third-party movement in the election. Several of his officials were compromised by Soviet intelligence. He starts sending information about the Sterns to the FBI. So Wallace was just a dupe in some ways in that respect. And I think it had, you know, not because he had any ties to Soviet espionage at the time. The Bureau really didn't know about penetrations of Roosevelt's administration. It suspected, and it certainly didn't like how pro-communist some of them were. What it was starting to find out was that Soviet officials were clearly trying to make inroads, you know, like into the Berkeley radiation lab, for instance, because they were following some of them around, and they were meeting with people talking about how do we get sources inside there. So they knew they were doing intelligence work, but it came about from paying attention to Soviet officials rather than kind of the other way, looking at, you know, people in the government who were spying.
Kind of a historical and then current and future question here. The FBI, I believe, was co-located in the Justice Department. Can you talk about how that
Some
developed?
days we say we're part of the Justice Department, some days they say it, sometimes it's the same day.
Geographically in the same building headquarters, and I'm
Yes.
curious where they are today, the FBI that is. What was on that land, and how did that develop in regards to getting them out of the main building? And where is the future FBI going to be in regards to another location, if that's still in the mix?
It's certainly still in the mix. The FBI and its predecessors have basically operated, headquarters has operated out of the main Department of Justice building, or, you know, one of its satellite buildings in DC, since the beginning. In the late, well, I should say, in the early mid-1960s, it was clear that the FBI had grown too large, and you know, the DOJ needed more of its own space back. So up until the mid-1960s, FBI headquarters was out of the main Department of Justice building, which is right across the street from the FBI headquarters today. J. Edgar Hoover's office was on the 5th floor. If you go to the corner of 9th and Pennsylvania, look up and look down 9th Street towards the Smithsonian, the first little kind of balcony offshoot from the window right on the corner there is Hoover's old office. They started to take over land across the street to build an FBI headquarters. The development and all that's kind of convoluted, but, you know, basically the design was controlled by the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation. It was meant to be, you know, a showpiece. Problem is, architecture in the 1950s and 60s was brutalist. So yeah, it was a showpiece, but not in a good way. We started moving in 74. We've been there pretty much since 75. We've been over capacity since about 75. In the 2000s, we started to consider we need a new facility. This one's having real problems because of its age. It doesn't fit us. We have people pretty much everywhere around the city at this point. We need something new. They come up with many millions of dollars. They start to study. They identify 3 properties, one in Maryland, one in DC, one in Virginia. All falls through. Come up with a new plan. Okay, we'll raise the FBI headquarters here. We'll move some of the positions to other places like Huntsville. And in fact, we are doing that. We're moving 1,200 people down that way. We're going to raise the building. We'll build a new building. And we'll do that. That fell through for a couple of reasons. So we're kind of back to ground zero. And at this point, I don't know what the current prognosis is, except that it will not happen until after I've retired. We haven't even re-entered the political phase, basically. So once we do, that'll take 4 or 5 years, even if it moves quickly. After that comes the site selection and all that planning, another couple of years, then the construction. So we're talking 12 to 15 years out. Even if they get started right now, I'm going to be gone.
Other questions?
As the war in Europe was winding down, the Army started moving officers, particularly out of the Special Plans Branch in 12th Army Group, into Latin America to conduct counterintelligence operations. Now, did they work with the FBI, or were they learning 2 parallel structures?
The Army and the FBI were actually working pretty closely together overall. I don't know the specifics on that move, especially since it was kind of in this period of change where the FBI was looking to be winding down its operations as soon as something else was stood up, because it was very clear Truman didn't want them there. And so the FBI was focusing more and more on its official liaison or its legal attaché offices, rather than on the undercover operations that they've been doing. They still went on and did until mid-47 when CIA took all those over. So my guess would be that there was cooperation on certain matters. They probably just ignored each other largely because they'd be looking for slightly different things. I mean, the Army was, well, I take that back because they were all looking basically for Nazis who fled. The Army probably looking for ones that had technical expertise that they might be able to catch. The FBI more broadly just making sure that you weren't having a resurgence that would backfire on us down there. But I don't know enough about the specifics on that one. Interesting question, though. Thank you.
After John Walker, there was a push to do reinvestigations rather than relying on the initial. I'd like to know, has that gone through or is it being pushed? And also related is the counterintelligence polygraph. Is that being expanded for sensitive positions?
That's kind of an evergreen sort of thing. It seems that every time we have an issue like that pop up, you get the idea that, we should spend a little more effort into those background investigations. The issue of having regular polygraphs in the IC is policy. If you have SAI clearance especially, certainly, it's required both, to come in the first place, and then you're supposed to have, in a sense, periodic repolygraphs. The problem with, in the wake of Hansen especially, I know in the Bureau that expanded financial checks are done every year. If you have SCI access, you are supposed to regularly, yearly, basically report on your financial status. That's supposed to be looked for so that, they're making sure that you're not falling into debt, you're not putting yourself into potentially compromising situation. The polygraphs, of course, are looking for connections with foreign intelligence officers not reported, or foreign nationals not reported, things like that. So it's basically an FCI check. But we seem to have recurring problems in that regard, and especially the wide expansion post 9/11 of people who are getting clearances has become a problem just because a good background check takes time and money. And if you have to bring a lot of people in quickly, people cut corners or things fall off the mark. Not going to comment on some of our more recent pseudo-leakers, people who take lots and lots of information and basically reveal it to the public for whatever reason, but you wonder if maybe a more comprehensive background check might have helped on some of that. But it's an ongoing problem, and it's one we got to keep in mind. It was a good thing that the FBI didn't want communists in its ranks during the Cold War. Making the arguments, though, about certain political positions becomes harder unless your political position is supporting an actually named terrorist group. That's fine, you can certainly keep them out then, but there are other ideologies that are anti-government or more in tune with some of the things. And on First Amendment grounds, it's hard to say you can keep someone out because of their political views. So it's a conundrum I don't think we'll solve. Certainly not easily.
Other questions? All right, let's thank John a whole lot.